Vladimir, we can't hear you.
Do you hear me now? Perfect. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Digital Label Masterclass webinar series. For those who haven't joined our previous events, we make those webinars to share knowledge and experience around digital label printing. Today, our topic is food labels printed with a hybrid UV flexo inkjet technology and why this topic deserves special attention. First of all, with the growth of digital printing, we see the increased adoption of hybrid UV flexo inkjet presses. And is it as a combination of two technologies? There is increasing number of questions on what materials should be used for such printing machines. We will handle this topic in the first part of this webinar. Secondly, as we're talking today about the food segment, there is a growing concern over food safety and label compliance for the food market, especially for the labels printed with UV cured inks. And this topic we'll cover in the second part of this webinar. To help us to address those questions, we have invited Luc Zonneveld, a product manager for Avery Dennison Europe. Luc has vast experience managing different label material portfolios, including the ones for the food market. We have also here John van Brughem, a compliance expert at Avery Dennison Europe. John has years of experience with regards to food regulation and compliance. And our special guest is Martin Leonard, who takes care of business development at Gallus. Martin also looks at Labelfire, a hybrid technology Gallus introduced several years ago. It will be interesting to see how both Avery Dennison, a label material manufacturer, and Gallus, a printing press manufacturer, look at the matters of food safety and compliance. Luc, John, and Martin, welcome and thank you for being here. And my name is Vladimir Tulpin. I will be your moderator for today. Before we begin, a couple of general comments. First of all, this webinar is recorded and will be available for you. The same is correct for the slides. Secondly, we encourage you to ask questions. To do that, you need to scroll down, and below the presentation, you see the place where you can do that. We will be answering your questions in the same place below, and the rest of the questions we will handle at the end. So we dedicated some of the time at the end for that. And thirdly, at the same place, if you scroll down, you see polls, and this is the place where we would like to ask you a question. And our question to you would be, considering a purchase of a new digital printing machine, which would you consider? And you have multiple answers to select from. Please select an answer which is most applicable to you, and we will look at the results together at the end. It will be great to see a lot of participation in this poll so we can enjoy good statistics in the end. With that said, let's go right into the session. And to begin with, we'll start with Luc, who will guide us through the labeling technology for the food segment. Luc? Luc, there are sound challenges.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you, Vladimir. Good morning to you all. Welcome to my attic. As Vladimir said, my name is Luc Zonneveld. I'm a product manager at Avery Dennison for over 10 years. In the next 10 minutes or so, I will take you through a few slides which will highlight some of the products which we offer for food labeling. You might have noticed as a consumer, there's premiumization happening in the marketplace. As a consumer, we increasingly look for better quality product. The packaging of these products also need to be high quality and look premium. Materials used for these labels highly contribute to this. We can see the same happening in, for example, labeling for wines, where the look and feel of a label of for non-wine experts are often a key decision maker. For food products, we offer a broad range of premium textured and tactile materials. We offer, for example, the R-Crus range. These type of materials are made with organic byproduct like barley or grape. What's very nice is that you can actually see small particles of these leftovers in the label. But also there's grease-proof. These materials protect labels from oily stains, which can happen when, for example, spilling olive oil. Food product producers can also not deny that the fact that there's demand for more sustainable packaging. In our view, sustainable development should first look at avoiding the usage of materials, followed by the reduction of materials using recycled content and design for recycling. We have to think beyond the point of use into afterlife and after use. Composting would be one of the potential ways of recycling. Since June, we can proudly say we have an OK Compost certified label material. These type of labels can be used where, for example, there's a move from fossil fuel plastic packaging to compostable bags or packaging for fruit and vegetables. To reduce food waste, there's also a range of reclosure labels, which include an oxygen barrier. These type of products, they extend shelf life, offer easy opening and a repeated resealability, and they deliver transparency that's required in see-through food packaging. However, existing barriers in these types of film often contain PVDC, which is considered a contaminant in the recycling stream. However, we now have also a PVDC-free oxygen barrier label solution. Typical applications would be fresh herbs, biscuits, sliced meat, cheese, and, for example, packed produce. Besides the products I just highlighted, others would be RMC. This is a coated paper with 30% post-consumer waste. And RPE, this plastic film, which also contains 30% post-consumer waste, can, for example, be used in squeezable bottles. Clean Flake is a technology which supports easy PET bottle and packaging recycling. And of course, if you want to know more, you can reach out to us. To label food products, there is a need of adhesive which can safely be in touch with the food product or its packaging. Some food products contain fat or grease that require special attention. We have various adhesives which are compliant for direct food labeling of fatty foods such as cheese, meat, fish, pastry, and chocolate. My colleague John will explain a little bit later more on the regulatory requirements. From the adhesives I show on the screen, I want to highlight S2800. This adhesive exhibits high adhesion on fresh meat in both ambient and heavily chilled conditions. Once we have shared a presentation with you later, also the links will take you to the product finder, where you can easily link through the products we have on offer already with these kind of adhesives. Apologies, I'm a little bit stuck here. Also, labeling of deep freeze products will potentially be challenging. For these applications, we have developed C2075. C2075 has a good tech and adhesion to a wide variety of packaging materials. Especially important is the good adhesion performance on frosted surfaces to a minimum application temperature of -25°C. In the link, also here on the screen in the green, you will find the link to our cold temperature labeling guide. In here, there is more explanation. These few slides were only a flavor of the food product labeling offer we have. On the screen, there's a more broad overview of the adhesive, which can be used for this segment. The adhesive all have different properties and can be combined with a large variety of face stocks. Besides the adhesive being food-approved, this overview also shows if it can be applied to fatty food and if US food approval is also applicable. Vladimir, now back to you.
Thank you, Luke. A great summary on the most relevant technologies and materials for the food segment. And as we started with, today we talk about food labels in the context of UV flexo inkjet printing. So it's important to know what materials are compatible with this technology. And on this slide, we listed all innovations Luke talked about just now, and we'll link them to the product specification and product names which are compatible with UV flexo inkjet press. We'd also like to share with you the tool, if you can go to the next slide, which we created for the owners of digital presses to easily find materials which are compatible with this or that digital printing press. To find this tool, it's an online tool, it's available publicly for everybody. To find this tool, you need to go to Avery Dennison European website, and in the right top corner, you will see the link to customer tools. By clicking that, you need to select digital material guide and you will enter the system. In this system, you just need to select your technology and the printing model, and you will have a list of products which are compatible with your machine. There are more filters, but as the tool is pretty interactive, I will not go too much in details. Before we go to the next part of this webinar, I have a quick reminder for you. If you scroll down, you will see a place where you can ask your questions, and next to it, you will see polls where we ask you one multiple choice question. Please answer this question and we will discuss the results in the end. We'll really appreciate your participation on that. With that said, I would like to hand it over to John, who will cover another important element concerning food labels. It's food regulation and food label compliance. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vladimir. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you, Vladimir, again, and welcome everyone to the second part of this presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the requirements, particularly the regulatory requirements when it comes to food contact compliance. So regulation generally is rather complex, and the words are as well. So please bear with me as I'm not an English native speaker. And some of these words can be quite lengthy, and I might be getting stuck. But nonetheless, let's start off with a little bit of things I will cover during the presentation. I will cover the regulatory part and provide a little bit of the basics, where Martin's going to go a little bit more into detail into inks and low migration of those inks and in all of the aspects of the food contact materials in particular. So food contact or food contact materials can be considered a high value segment for you or for us, but the basics of it and the compliance basics of it cover more than just food. They also cover pharmaceutical requirements, extractables and leachables, cosmetics, and can be used in that sense for more than just food. So when we are covering the basics, it's important to understand what is required from your perspective, from the converter perspective. Generally, it does require you to go into a little bit more detail in what kind of requirements are there. Good manufacturing practice, for instance, documentation gathering, all those kind of things. So I'm not going to talk specifically on good manufacturing practice. I'm going to leave that for Martin. But in general, it does require a little bit more work than just printing and cutting some labels. It does involve the whole supply chain, meaning that you need to communicate a little bit more with suppliers, as well as suppliers, ink suppliers, and label stock suppliers like Avery Dennison, because you need to gather some information. So it does involve a little bit of knowledge on that regulation and responsibilities, which might make it a little bit more complex to make sure that you meet those requirements from a regulatory perspective or from a customer / end user perspective. So without further ado, I'm going to start off with explaining a little bit about the regulation. So it all trickles down to this particular regulation called the Food Contact Framework Regulation here in Europe. I'm not going to cover US, I'm not going to cover China, mainly because the EU Food Contact Regulation is covering a lot of ground and is very closely tied to the Chinese way of working. Not so much to the FDA way of working, but if you have questions, please ask them. I can answer them further down the line. So this 1935-2004 consists of different articles. Of course, it's a regulation, but one of the most important ones is Article 3, and this mentions that food contact materials needs to be safe and inert. Now, I'm paraphrasing. There are a lot of other requirements mentioned in there. Good manufacturing practice is also specifically mentioned, but it's important to understand that everything that is in contact with consumer products needs to be safe for the consumer. So a food contact material cannot make unacceptable changes in the quality or organoleptics of the food, the odor and taste. It cannot be using any hazardous materials such as carcinogenic, mutagenic, and reprotoxic substances, and it cannot mask any alteration or quality of the food. So if a food goes bad, the packaging should not alter it to show that it is not adulterated, for instance. So furthermore, there are two parts that I'm going to cover in this slide as well, which is Article 5 and Article 17. Article 17 further down the line in the slide after this, but Article 5 is important to know because this article provides that there can be specific measures for groups of materials. So the Food Contact Framework Regulation 1935-2004 specifies requirements for 17 different food contact materials, ranging from ceramics to adhesives to cork. But not all of those have specifically been regulated. The harmonized ones are the ones that have a specific regulation tied to them, and they always fall under that 1935-2004, making it the requirement it needs to be safe, and it cannot change all of the before mentioned. One of the most well-known or notorious ones is the plastics regulation, which is the 10/2011. So in 2011, the plastics have been regulated in a specific regulation, and the chief control measure has been migration. I'm going to talk to you about that in a little bit. It's important to understand that while regulated and harmonized, there's only one regulation that covers every single material, every single plastic in the European Union. However, in the orange part in the slide here, it shows that there's also a non-harmonized group, which is actually the majority of all of the different food contact materials. Paper and board, printing inks, adhesives, and varnishes are the most applicable to our industry, and they are actually not harmonized, meaning that there's no specific regulation for them. And that means that we need to tend to these particular food contact materials by looking at the member state regulations and or the industry requirements. So although Switzerland is not a member state, they do have an ordinance on printing inks. And while there's no specific member state other than Italy mentioning the adhesives in a regulation, there is a specific guidance from the FICA on how to make sure that the adhesives are food contact compliant. So there's a guidance in place. And we use that to make sure that all of the materials, also when non-harmonized, can comply with that food contact framework regulation. So I'm going to cover Article 17 in another slide. But the next one, I'm going to talk a little bit about migration. So the main principle of migration is that anything that is wrapped in and anything that is in the packaging of a food can migrate unless there's a functional barrier. I'm not going to cover that particularly, but if it's glass or aluminium or PET at a certain thickness, nothing can migrate through by definition. But if it's a plastic, like a PE or a PP or a paper for that matter, anything that is in that paper PE can migrate into the food. That is the basic principle. And we look at two main parts of migration, which is covered in the 10/2011. The overall migration at the one hand and the specific migration at the other end. So in this example, I'm showing a chocolate bar in a wrapper, and it has a label wrapped around it with an adhesive label stock ink, and it might even have a varnish for that matter. So everything that is used, every chemical or substance that is used and should be cured is used that can eventually migrate into the food. The longer a substance is in contact with the food, the more susceptible it is to migration into the food. So the overall migration in this case will be everything that is migrate. The full sum of the materials that migrate is the overall migration. And that cannot exceed a limit, a threshold of 60 milligrams per kilogram of food. So this is the inertness principle. The material that you use, the final packaging, needs to be as inert as possible and not going past that 60 milligrams per kilogram of food. While this sum is important, it's also important to realize that there are specific substances in that full migration into the food. And I'm going to use the example from the adhesives part because that's what I'm most familiar with. Acrylic acid has a specific migration of 6 milligrams per kilogram of food. So 10 times less than the overall migration. So while the overall migration can be below the limit, we also need to make sure that that specific substance, acrylic acid, is not exceeding these 6 milligrams per kilogram of food. Hence, it is a specific migration limit set for that substance. So there, the 10/2011 plastics regulation has been referred to because it provides a long list of substances with or without a specific migration limit. And these substances are allowed to be used in plastics, even though we know that they can be hazardous at a certain limit, above a certain limit, excuse me. They are still able to be used. So this is the principle. We have to look at two things: overall migration and specific migration of substances like acrylic acid, like anything that can migrate out of the adhesive, out of the ink, out of the label stock, the face stock. So I hope that is clear. So back to a little bit of the complexity and communication that is mentioned in Article 17. There are some responsibilities that we have as Avery Dennison, you have as a converter and the end user to make sure that we comply with the food contact regulations. So your responsibility is rather much the same as Avery Dennison's. Gather information in the supply chain from Avery Dennison and issue a declaration of compliance for your material. So these two things combined is already quite a lot of work. You need to gather documentation, and if in any case, you need to make sure that the documentation that you provide to the end user or brand owner or your customer for that matter is sound. So there are two things that you need to take into consideration. On the one hand, it's the regulation. On the other hand, we also might need to take into consideration some customer-specific requirements. You might have heard of the Nestle guidance, which is a specific guidance for materials that food contact materials that eventually flow through the Nestle manufacturing process. But there are other customers that have specific requirements as well, like Procter & Gamble or any bigger ones. So it's important to understand who's asking for the information, who's asking for a specific product in what kind of application. Because if it eventually ends up in a more rigorous kind of control scheme, like for Nestle, you need to make sure that it's also applicable to them. So let me see here. I'm going to go to the final slide already. I've covered a little bit of ground on this whole topic. And if I'm going into more detail of what the requirements are from our side, from your side, from the end user side, it's important to understand the regulations and responsibilities. So if I've covered already a little bit of the regulations, there's much more to tell. And a little bit on the responsibilities of you, of Avery Dennison, and we can always help you out with that. So gaining knowledge in that sense is also very important, because in this one presentation, you won't get all of the answers. I'm giving you a little bit of the answers, unfortunately, because there's much more to tell. So gain knowledge by asking your suppliers for documentations, and also like the declaration of compliance, but also ask a little bit more on if you give a little bit of information on the application, you might get a little bit more information as well. It's important that you do not throw all of the documentations over the fence to the end users. it might even be better to create your own documentation. So if you have documents from your ink supplier as well as your label stock supplier, make sure that you provide that kind of information in your own documentation. So seems a little bit more professional even, and it also gives you the actual legal status of the declaration of compliance. And I have not covered this at a high level yet, but choose a partner that is able to help you in this respect. Eventually, some of the assessment and testing that needs to be done can be done by a third-party testing laboratory. So there's a lot of players on the market, and not all of them have the same kind of expertise when it comes to label stock or converted materials for that matter. So it's good to choose a partner that you trust and that you know that has the right kind of expertise. And finally, it's very good to clearly communicate what the requirements are. So regulation dictates kind of, if you communicate through the supply chain, you will get the information you need. And it's actually required to provide more information on the application than just asking for a declaration of compliance from us, and for us as well, from our suppliers. So the more specific we are, the more specific requirements we get, the easier it is for us to give out documentation, statements, approvals, etc. So follow the chain of supply, follow the chain of communication on these kind of applications, and a lot more information will be visible for you and for the customer, creating a more sound and business appropriate setting for the documentation you're providing on food contact materials. So with that note, I'm going to hand it over back to Vladimir. Thank you for your attention. If there are questions still, there's a section below where I'm going to look at after my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Very good summary and compliance requirements for the food market. While John and Luke are looking if there are any questions from you, let's quickly recap on what has been just discussed before we move on. So Luke gave us an overview of special materials and adhesives used for food segments, and we summed it up with a product recommendation for a hybrid press. Then John looked at label material from food compliance point of view, and our session would not be complete if we will not discuss another important element of today's topic, the food labels, is the ink migration. And to handle this question, we have our special guest, Martin Leonard from Gallus. Gallus, known on the market primarily for their flexo press machines, also now active in digital printing with their Labelfire hybrid system. And I will hand it over to Martin, who will share with us how at Gallus they approach ink migration challenge. And in the meantime, Martin will focus mainly on ink migration and give you a little bit of introduction of their press. But if you, for example, have other questions on Labelfire and on hybrid printing, on print quality, etc., please put your questions below. We will have enough time at the end to handle those. Martin?
Thank you, Luke. I hope, thank you, Vladimir. Everybody hears me clear and loud? It's
perfect.
Okay? Very good. So welcome to the third part of our webinar. And you might ask yourself, how comes that Gallus as a press manufacturer is being confronted with a low migration challenge? Now, we think we know how to tackle the low migration challenge, basically because we were confronted with the digital hybrid press Gallus Labelfire, as you know. The challenge comes not from the flexo printing units. This has been solved a long time ago already. But if you look at a Gallus Labelfire configuration, you see that in the upstream section, we have flexo printing units. Then we have the challenging parts, which is the digital printing unit with all the digital print bars. I'm coming to that in a minute. Downstream, after the digital print bar, we have again numerous flexo units, which you can then use for cold foil, for varnishing, for any other application. And in the end, we have a die cutter usually. So the press gives you the one-pass productivity, which means we are able, or you are able, to manufacture a ready-to-apply label from the virgin reel to the rewound bobbin in one pass without going to any other converting equipment. The second thing which I would like to mention for the Labelfire is the unique level of integration. Due to the overall complexity of the press, you need to master conventional printing skills as well as digital printing skills, which are more like pre-press skills. Just to master this complexity, we integrated completely the digital section, the digital print unit, with the conventional parts, and all is controlled by one HMI. And last but not least, we know in comparison to other digital printing presses, we are able to offer the embellished labels with cold foil, anything other upstream and downstream at lowest costs. So I said already, the challenge of low migration. Why is that? Mostly because of the digital printing unit. We are using these Fuji film printheads with 1200 dpi by 1200 dpi, and simply due to the resolution, the native resolution of the printing heads, we have very, very small jets there. And if you want then to use digital ink, it has to be very low, it has to have very low viscosity, which means you have incredible small particles and very small molecules, and the ink still has to stay jettable. But especially the small molecules and the low viscosity, they tend to migrate. And this is the reason why we think only a maker who is able to master the holistic approach, the holistic system approach, which means mastering the module digital printing, mastering the pre-press area, and the ink will be also on a long-term successful. Why is that so? I will tell you in a minute. Now, when we're speaking about migration, low migration challenge, or migration as itself, we learned already that we have basically two ways of migration. The one is the penetration, which means ingredients of the ink are intruding in the packaged good. That might be photo initiators, solvents, and so on. That's the migration or the penetration. The other migration is the offset migration, which is basically achieved because of insufficient curing, and you will have a layoff of the printed image on the backside of your substrate, and in the end, if this substrate is in contact or with a packaged good, then it might again migrate by penetration. There are other forms of migration in the vapor phase or condensation, extraction, whatever, with cooking, sterilization, but this one I will not cover in this presentation. Okay. Now, what is the solution space for a converter or for a print buyer if you want to master the migration challenge? When we're coming from the good, that would be at the filling good would be at the bottom. Then, of course, we have a container. Container may have barrier properties because they are of PET, metal, aluminum, and so on. Then you're fine. In case this is not the case, because these containers are expensive, the next area for mitigation would be the substrate. And there we just learned from Luke that Avery Dennison is offering a lot of substrates with barrier properties. If we are coming then to the face stock of the substrate, if you have paper face stock, then you must use a primer. That's what we learned, because otherwise the inks tend to sink into the substrate, especially these low viscosity inks from Inkjet. And only with the primer you prevent the sinking in. The sunk in volumes actually change the ratios of the ingredients, and therefore it might imperfectly cure. And then we're coming to the ink itself. First of all, the low migration ink has to have the right ingredients, obeying to the Swiss ordinance and so on. The ingredients have to be very pure, that you don't have any pollution in there. With the pre-press and artwork, you can minimize the ink volume, and therefore what is not on the substrate or in the artwork can't migrate. And of course, you have to have an optimized curing system to ensure that the ink is really properly cured. In the end, you could also add some overprint varnish or some lamination film to prevent the offset migration. However, we are trying to work with these orange articles, or the orange areas, which means low migration ink, with means pre-press and artwork and optimized curing system, and primer case by case in case you're using paper face stock. When we're speaking about migration and ink systems, there has to be some basic understanding. First of all inks and varnishes are equal. It does not make any difference when it comes to the migration, anti-migration regulations, what kind of ink system you're using. The rules are everywhere the same. It doesn't matter if you have UV or solvent-based or water-based inks. Every time you have the same regulations. Then you have a lot of potential migrants, of course. One is to highlight. That's the solvents and washes and cleaning chemicals which you might use in your print shop for your presses. It happens often, that I was told by certified test bodies, when a customer wants to get the low migration certificate. The test body identifies a lot of solvents which are not in the inks or in the glues or somewhere else, but they are brought into the press and contaminated the press because the converter cleaned the press due to the low migration tests he wants to get done, but with a not applicable solvent, which is not following the rules. And there's no standard definition for low migration. Also, low odor products, no smell, will not necessarily show low migration, and low migration does not mean no migration. Low migration means that these inks are able to meet the legal migration levels if correctly applied and cured with the right packaging concept. When we are looking to the migration, I want to not go back to the items which John already covered. The most important regulation I want to hint is the regulation which basically focuses on GMP, good manufacturing progress. Actually, everybody in the food packaging chain has to follow GMP standards. And that means mostly that you need to have a proper documentation, as also hinted out by John. Again, in this regulation, it's focusing on migration by penetration and migration by offset, and it is defining the trigger values, which are still under these trigger values, you're able to pass low migration tests. Above them, you will fail. And these are these 6 ppm, parts per million, are basically the 6 milligram substance per kilogram food. So how is that then being testified? I mean, this is is a very important information. The testified or the certified test body, which might be SQTS in Switzerland or Fabes in Germany, numerous other labs are available. They usually work with a simulant. They are not using the real food. And simulants are over here on the left side in the scale, in the table. And there you see, for example, with alcohol, they are simulating all types of food. So they want to have a real produced commercial label or even package, and then they will cut out of this package with this container, with this substrate, this glue, this varnish. They will cut out a probe, put it into alcohol, and store it at defined conditions. And on the right-hand side, you see the conditions. For example, when they store it for 10 days at 40 degrees Celsius, they are simulating storage on a frozen or freezer long-term at room temperature with a shelf time under 30 days. Why is that so important? Because the testified low migration values in the end are only valid for this specific composition. If you use then the same artwork with the same inks on a different container, it might be different already. Or if you have another batch of substrate or ink, it might be different, depending how far you are away from the trigger values in the end. The important thing for us as Gallus is that we have proven with our system approach that we are able to meet these requirements. So low migration is not a marketing hoax. It's not enough to just claim that you're doing low migration. You have to prove it, and that can be only proved by a certified test body, a third party who is really telling you that are the migration values in this specific tested composition. So what parameters are influencing migration? Again, important, barrier function of the material. That might be container and substrate. Container is print buyer responsibility. Substrate, for example, is also print buyer, but we've just learned that Avery Dennison offering there a whole lot of different solutions. I cannot be strict enough and open enough with the storage conditions of finished goods. Why? Just imagine you have finished your completely perfectly printed low migration reel, and this bobbin is being stored at your place or at your print buyer's place in a warehouse where it's getting heated up. Even better, imagine having this lorry and truck who is used for shipment standing in a traffic jam for 1 or 2 days in the sun. So all of a sudden, your reel of perfectly produced low migration labels will become a migration label. And then, of course, we have the issue with the ink ingredients following various requirements. And in the end, of course, everything has to be minimized for low migration. Again, the formulation of the ink has to be GMP and low migration compliant. Also, the amount of ink used for a kilogram in food or the size of label is impacting the low migration values. If you have a very small packaging with a very small packaged volume and you put a big label on it, then it might be a migration, or might be not meeting the migration trigger values. But if you use the same label on a big food packaging with a kilogram of food in there, it's a whole different story. And in the end, of course, you need to have inert curing capabilities to really meet all these and to optimize the curing of the ink. For you as a converter, what does that mean for your operations? It's a team approach, even in your company. Look at pre-press. You need to look for dedicated press so that you not do any cross-contamination. You need to use the approved cleaners and solvents, as mentioned before. And of course, you need to ensure optimized curing conditions with cleaned reflectors. UV lamp time inspected. Same with printing. Monitor your web and chill roller's temperature. dedicated mixing equipment. And post-press, even offline lamination, you have to apply again the same glues, and you have to respect the time and pressure conditions on your stack and document them. Everything has to be focused on controlling and limiting any potential source of contamination. And again, here we can't stress enough, you see in every line, you see the last point: document print job settings, document print job settings, document traceability. In the end, if something goes wrong, you will have to prove that it was not on your hands, that the prints, the printed goods, the finished goods you were delivering to your print buyer was meeting the requirements and the standards. So documentation will be key, as well as following good manufacturing practices. So low migration, you can be only compliant in a team gameplay. All members of the food packaging chain will have to follow GMP, the raw materials supplier, ink manufacturer, printer or converter as yourself, as well as the brand owner. And again, all these things can be only certified by external institutes. You need to have here a proof. You have to have an evidence. And of course, you want to avoid any migrations of substances in food contact. And you do not want to do any adulteration of food, which is very easy. Your responsibility is on the right-hand side. You're fine if you're following your customer requirements. Usually the customer will ask you for a declaration of conformity. And again, documented evidence is required. You need to have documents and ensure GMP. So in the end, how did we as Gallus, as the Heidelberg Group, in the end achieve these testified low migration results? First of all, we have to be able, of course, to minimize the ink volume. So Heidelberg is offering our own pre-press solution, which is called Prenect. And there we have a mode where we really achieve the lowest necessary ink volume to reach the color. Because what is not on the substrate cannot migrate. Very easy. Second, this ink has to be then manufactured after GMP rules. It has to follow with the ingredients, the Swiss Ordinance list and the Nestle list, of course. And it has to stay jettable, as said before, very small molecules, low viscosity. Otherwise, you don't get the print quality. The fourth thing is, of course, then you need to have inert curing capabilities also in the digital print unit. It's quite common in the conventional area, but you need to offer that also in the inert curing capabilities in the digital print unit. And you need also to have additional UV booster, which is a lot of UV power to ensure that in the end you have also in-depth curing. And all that, and this is the last key point, has to be, of course, proven. So you need a couple more sensors for UV performance and for the available oxygen level. Otherwise, you cannot prove it, you cannot document it, and therefore you will not follow the GMP rules again. So I would like to thank you for your attention and hand back over to our host, Vladimir. And I think now we're going to the wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. It was very insightful. I'm sure it helped our listeners to answer many questions they had on ink migration, and I'm sure some of them will approach you individually or your colleagues to learn about your printing systems. With that, let's go and look at the questions we have. And there's one question to you, Martin. And the question is, I'm sure you covered some of these, partially this question during the session, but if you could summarize once again, it would be great. So the question is, how can you assure the ink, both UV flexo and UV inkjet, is cured 100% in order to be food safe?
again, we need to have inert curing capabilities, of course, which means to cure the flexo applied inks as well as the digital applied inks under nitrogen. That's the first thing. The second thing, of course, is you need to have enough UV power in our case, and then you will have sensors there which are really measuring the oxygen level, so that you know that you are under inert conditions under the 1000 ppm or 500 ppm, as well as that you have enough curing power with that you don't have polluted mirrors and reflectors and stuff like that. But in the end, the real proof of the pudding will be done by a testified test body. So like a laboratory like Fabes in Munich, for example, only they can really give you the proof that you're meeting the low migration values and not passing the trigger values.
Thank you, Martin. There's another question to Luke. So you talked about multiple kind of different technologies in the food segments. So which of those technologies do you see having more traction and ramping up on the markets in the last months, years?
Yeah, if we talk about the last months, it's a tricky one because, of course, the Corona situation made it a little bit different than half a year ago. But if we talk about the recent developments outside Corona, for sure, what we always get asked is sustainable solutions. Yeah, so we increasingly keep getting questions about. Do you have products to offer with recycled content? Do you have products to offer with bio-based content? Lower weight products, so easier to recycle products. So for sure, sustainability is absolutely one of the key drivers for future development and the questions we get from customers. On top of that, and I highlighted that as well, is premiumization. So consumers, like we all are, they really want to buy a nice product. Yeah, you can talk about biological types of meat, all kinds of fruit and vegetables being bio. In your packaging, you also want to see that premium type of products. Yeah, so also there, a big driver is for labels looking more premium. So more tactile, so you can feel it also from a distance. It looks very nice. Also, you see a lot of embossing. You see a lot of foiling. It really needs to stand out and make sure that it also looks premium.
Thank you, Luke. And I also have a question, actually, my question to John. While listening to you, I was wondering, you talk a lot about EU regulations with regards to food safety, but we are working on the markets, broader geographical Europe, and not all the countries belong to the European Union. So do you see major differences between EU regulations and the regulations you have for food safety in other countries in geographical Europe?
Okay. Thank you, Vladimir. So I think I can cover this in two, maybe three sections. A lot of the countries that are in geographical Europe might even fall under the economic area. I've already mentioned Switzerland, and they abide by the European laws. So though the food contact material regulation is between brackets applicable there, or they've put something similar in place in their own regulatory bodies. So another part would be a non-economic area, might even consider Turkey. They have imposed similar regulations as well. So in that sense, if you comply with the European legislation, you're able to comply with those requirements as well. But it's actually like Martin has mentioned as well, if you test it by a third-party laboratory, then or have it assessed by a third-party laboratory, not necessarily tested, then you are almost good to go in those regions as well. So maybe another one that might be a little bit different is Russia. Russia has agreements with the customs union, the EAAE, something like that, or the AEEA. including Kazakhstan, I think, and Georgia. So they do not necessarily have a regulation in place for food packaging, for that matter, but packaging in very general sense. And they require similar kind of testing as the European Union, but have some specification, just a little bit of other specifications. But generally, in that case, if you comply with the European Union requirements, they will accept it as well. So it's basically on what it's basically revolving around what is accepted where, and the European Union requirements are covering a lot of ground already. Not so much on the US side, but from a European topographical area, it is mostly covered already.
Great, thank you, John. And I think we're coming close to the end. We have one more question. I'm not sure actually who can answer that. So the question is on embossing and foiling. So emboss and foil on inkjet. The ink is slippery. How does it foil? Honestly, I don't clearly understand the question, but maybe Martin, if you understand the question, maybe you can help to answer that.
Maybe the question here can detail it much more. We are using also embossing units on our presses, also on the Labelfire, and as of today, we don't see a challenge with the embossing itself.
Okay.
So at least not on the label, on the flexible label materials. It might, the only thing that might happen that shall also not be withheld, the Labelfire ink or these digital inks have a tendency to become brittle after the curing. So if you emboss too much, it's a too high embossing, then there might be ink cracks as a result, which are of course unacceptable to the print buyer. But in the end, it's a trial and error thing. You need to test it and do implication development in the end and find out what is the utmost height for your embossing. We did not have any issues with slipperiness so far.
Okay, thank you. I see there are more questions coming, but unfortunately we need to wrap up the session. But don't worry, we'll follow up with you individually. We have your email addresses, so we'll contact you and make sure we answer the questions you asked. On that note, I would like to thank Martin, John, and Luke once again. Very interesting insights today. Now let's look quickly at our polls. And I remember the question was considering the purchase of a new digital printing machine, which we consider. And there were several options like hybrid flexo inkjet, hybrid flexo toner, standalone inkjet, standalone toner, and other. And surprisingly for me, 66% of the participants in the polls replied hybrid flexo inkjet. Surprisingly, because we just discussed this topic before the webinar, and I was very convinced that standalone toner will have most people will vote for, well, will select this option. But probably this is due to the fact that we have a specific audience who is interested in specifically hybrid machines. And everybody, you can see the results of the polls below yourself if you're interested. Finally, to the participants, thank you very much for joining. We now have a pause with the webinars until the end of summer, but we have more ideas in the pipeline. So follow up our newsletter, and you will hear more from us after announcements after the holiday break. On that note, I would like to close the session. I wish you a great day, and I see you in September. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.